December 1944, the smell of the beginning. I arrived at Auschwitz in a freight car filled with silence and bodies that no longer breathed. The air smelled like iron and fear. When they tattooed the number 42,178 on my arm, I realized I no longer had a name. I was not a man, I was inventory. The guards shouted in German, their boots striking the frozen ground like drums of command. Smoke curled from chimneys that never stopped. I asked one of the older prisoners what was being burned. He looked at me without emotion and said, "Everything." That was my welcome. The barracks were wooden skeletons filled with bones that still spoke. We were fed soup made of shadows and dreams, and when one of us fell, no one looked down. Hope was an infection that spread faster than disease. I learned to move without making a sound, to breathe without being noticed. Each dawn, we lined up for the count, the guards' eyes sharper than their rifles. One mistake, one cough, and someone vanished. At night, the camp smelled of wet ashes. From the fences, I could see the world beyond, gray, indifferent, unreachable. I thought of my parents, of Krakow before the war, of the bakery on Starowislna Street where my mother used to buy bread. I tried to remember her face, but the image dissolved like smoke. That terrified me more than death itself. Some prisoners whispered that liberation would come soon, that the Allies were pushing back the Germans in the West. But here, the war felt eternal. Auschwitz was its own world, a planet of despair orbiting around death. The guards joked, the dogs barked, and the sky above us remained the same, pale, heavy, and watching. One evening, as I shoveled snow mixed with ashes, a piece of fabric stuck to my shoe. It was blue, with the pattern of a child's dress. I stood frozen, holding it in my hands. A guard shouted and hit me across the back. I didn't feel the pain, I only saw the cloth fall to the ground, vanishing under the snow. That night, I couldn't sleep. I understood, finally, what the smell meant. It was not smoke. It was memory, burning forever. I made a silent promise to myself, if I ever escaped, I would tell the world. I didn't know how, or when. But I knew one thing, even if my body rotted in this place, my story would not. The cold bit my skin, the hunger gnawed at my soul, but a small ember of defiance remained. Auschwitz could steal my name, but not my voice. December 1944, the voices that stopped speaking. The days after my arrival dissolved into one endless repetition: cold, hunger, commands, and silence. Auschwitz had a rhythm, a monstrous routine where even death followed a schedule. Every morning, the guards blew their whistles, and we rose from our wooden bunks like ghosts answering roll call. Some didn't move. The block leader dragged their bodies out and left them by the fence until evening. We were told to keep working. The smoke above the crematorium was the only thing that never rested. At first, I tried to talk to others. I wanted to know their names, their cities, the stories that brought them here. But one by one, the voices stopped speaking. Not because of death, but because words no longer mattered. When you are surrounded by screams, silence becomes a form of mercy. A man named Merrick used to pray every night, whispering to a god who had gone deaf. One morning, he was gone. His bunk was empty, and nobody asked why. We all knew better. Questions were a luxury we couldn't afford. Work became our only clock. We carried stones from one end of the camp to the other, building walls that would never stand. Some collapsed under the weight, others under the hopelessness. I remember a boy, no older than 16, who fell during roll call. The guard made him stand, then hit him again until he couldn't rise anymore. The boy's name was Samuel. After that day, the name disappeared, but his eyes never left me. At night, I listened to the coughing, the moaning, the soft sound of people dying without protest. The worst part wasn't the noise, it was when the noise stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, as if the camp itself swallowed their existence. We became numbers, shadows, functions in a machine designed to erase memory. Yet, even there, humanity refused to die completely. Once, an old man shared a piece of bread with me, a piece no bigger than my thumb. "Eat," he said, "and remember me when this ends." I never learned his name, but his kindness burned brighter than the crematorium's fire. Rumors drifted through the camp like the cold wind, whispers of Russian advances, of German losses, of liberation. But none of it reached us. The guards grew more nervous, more violent. We knew that when the Germans began to fear, it meant we would suffer even more. Survival became mathematics, one wrong number, and you vanished. That night, as I lay on the wooden plank that served as my bed, I realized the truth. Auschwitz was not only a place of death. It was a place where time itself was murdered. And yet, every breath I took, every second I stole from the camp's design, was rebellion. The voices around me had stopped speaking, but inside my chest, another began to form, the voice that would one day tell the world what was done here. January 1945, the man who spoke of the sky. He arrived one morning, limping, his uniform striped and torn like everyone else's. His name was Dr. Karel Novak, a Czech physician captured near Prague. Unlike most new prisoners, he didn't look afraid. There was a strange calm in his eyes, not resignation, but something else, something that unsettled the guards. He worked in the infirmary barrack, where medicine was as scarce as mercy, yet he still tried to heal with whatever scraps he could find. We met when I was sent there after collapsing during roll call. My ribs had cracked from a beating, and I was barely conscious. Novak cleaned the wound with snow and whispered, "Don't talk. Listen." His hands trembled from exhaustion, but his voice was steady. "They can break the body," he said, "but not the witness." I didn't understand what he meant then. I only wanted to survive another day. He told me later, while we worked side by side carrying buckets of ash, that he used to teach medicine in Brno before the war. "I believed in science," he said. "Now I believe in memory. Science heals the body, memory heals the world." He had seen too much, the experiments, the selections, the trucks that came at night and never returned. Yet, somehow, he still looked at the sky. "It's blue today," I once said, trying to remember what freedom felt like. He smiled sadly. "That's not blue," he answered. "That's smoke. The wind just makes it look like the heavens are still there." He was the first man in that place who dared to speak about the outside world. He whispered news, fragments carried by rumors, smuggled through the wire. "The Red Army crossed the Vistula," he said one night. "They're coming." His hope was dangerous, almost forbidden. Hope made people careless. Hope got people killed. Still, his words spread quietly through the camp. Prisoners started lifting their heads a little higher, stepping a little stronger. The guards noticed. Hope to them was infection. One morning, Novak was gone. His bunk was empty. Some said he'd been transferred. Others said he'd been hanged near the crematorium. That evening, I stood outside during roll call, my breath turning to frost. The sky was red with sunset, but all I saw was gray. I thought of Novak's voice, of the way he said the heavens were a lie, and yet, he had been the only one who looked at them. That night, I made my decision. If the sky was made of smoke, then I would find the place where it cleared. I didn't know how, or if I would live to see it. But I swore I would escape, and if I did, I would become what Novak believed in, the witness. January 1945, the plan of the loose bricks. The idea began in whispers, passed like contraband between breaths. It started with Piotr, a Polish mason who worked near the crematorium. He had seen things, spaces between the bricks, tunnels that carried ash and water beneath the ground. One night, while we were cleaning tools in silence, he leaned close to me and murmured, "The earth here swallows everything, even smoke. Maybe it could swallow us too." At first, I thought he was delirious. But when I saw the glint in his eyes, I knew he wasn't talking madness, he was talking freedom. There were 6 of us, Piotr, Marek, Joseph, a tailor named Abram, a young boy no older than 15 called Leon, and me. Each of us had lost everything, which made us dangerous, men with nothing left to fear. The plan was simple and suicidal. Use the drainage tunnels that carried ashes from the crematorium to the river beyond the camp's fence. They were narrow, filled with filth and frozen sludge, and covered by iron grates rusted into the concrete. No one believed a man could fit through them. That was why we might succeed. We met in secret after the evening count, using our bodies to block the view of the guards. Piotr had stolen a rusted spoon, sharpened into a blade, and every night he loosened a few bricks near the corner of the washroom. Each piece removed was hidden under straw or buried in the snow. We took turns watching, praying that the dogs wouldn't catch the scent. Every noise, Every shadow could mean death. Inside the camp, rumors said the Germans were preparing to evacuate the prisoners. "Marches," someone whispered. "They'll move us west before the Soviets arrive." None of us wanted to find out what that meant. The plan had to happen soon. One evening, the alarms blared. Someone had tried to escape from another block and been caught. We were forced to stand outside in the snow for hours while the guards made an example of him. They tied the man to the fence, his body shaking against the voltage. The smell of burnt flesh drifted through the cold. Pyotr didn't look away. He just whispered, "That's what happens when you try alone." After that, the plan was no longer a rumor. It was destiny. We would wait for a night with fog thick enough to hide our movement. Each of us memorized our part. Who would remove the grate, who would crawl first, who would cover the hole. The only thing we didn't decide was what came after the fence. None of us dared imagine that far. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the chimneys haunted me, the hiss of fire, the crack of burning. I thought of Dr. Novak and his words about memory. Maybe the world would never know our names. But if one of us escaped, even one, then the sky would have to remember. I pressed my hand against the frozen wall, feeling the loosened bricks beneath my palm. They trembled slightly, like they were breathing. The wall that imprisoned us would soon become our path to freedom. And so, among ashes and fear, the impossible began to take shape. December 1944, the night of the fog. The night we chose felt alive, as if the air itself knew what we were about to do. A thick fog rolled across Auschwitz, swallowing the towers and blurring the floodlights into ghostly halos. It was the kind of mist that muffled sound, erased outlines, and made the world feel smaller, closer, possible. Pyotr said quietly, "If there's ever a night God looks away, it's this one." We moved after the final count. The guards were tired, their boots heavy from the snow. The dogs paced but barked less, even they seemed dulled by the cold. The six of us met near the washroom, where the ground was damp and black with soot. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding louder than the sirens that haunted my dreams. Merrick knelt first, his fingers trembling as he pulled away the bricks we had loosened night after night. Beneath them, a narrow hole yawned, dark, foul, and full of promise. Pyotr went first. He slid into the drain head first, pushing with his elbows. I followed, clutching a small scrap of cloth that Zofia, the woman from the kitchen who had once slipped me an extra crust of bread, had given me days before. "If you get out," she'd whispered, "remember those who didn't." I tucked it into my shirt. The tunnel was narrower than I imagined. Filth coated my face and hands. The stench was unbearable, a mixture of ash, sewage, and decay. I had to turn my head sideways just to breathe. Behind me, Leon whispered prayers, his voice shaking with fear. In front, Pyotr grunted, moving inch by inch. Every scrape of metal, every splash of water echoed like thunder. Then, a light. A sudden flash above us, a guard's lantern sweeping the ground. We froze. The beam lingered for what felt like eternity. My body stiffened, lungs screaming for air. A dog barked once, twice. Then silence. The light moved on. I felt Pyotr's foot twitch ahead of me, and we continued. When I finally reached the grate that marked the outer fence, my fingers were numb, my vision blurred. The metal was half frozen, but Pyotr managed to push it free. We crawled out into the mud, beneath a sky we had not seen in months. No stars, only fog and freedom. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. There was no time. We had to run. We scattered into the darkness, heading toward the forest. Behind us, the camp loomed, a beast of smoke and fire receding into mist. Then came the sound of barking. A shout. A gunshot. I dropped to the ground, covering myself in the ash and mud. The fog thickened, hiding me from the searchlights. I lay there for hours, shaking, afraid to breathe. When dawn came, the camp was gone behind the haze. My legs were bleeding, my chest burned with frost, but I was alive. Freedom didn't feel like triumph, it felt like exile. As I crawled toward the trees, one thought echoed in my mind. I had escaped hell, but hell wasn't done with me yet. December 1944, 3 days without a name. The forest swallowed me whole. It was silent, heavy, and endless, a graveyard made of snow and trees. My striped uniform, soaked and stiff, clung to me like a second skin. Every breath turned to mist, every step was a fight against the cold. I no longer had a name, a camp, or a number. Just a body moving through whiteness, trying not to die. The first day, I followed no path. The moon hid behind the fog, and I moved by instinct, away from the gunfire, away from the barking. I stumbled through thorns and branches that tore my skin. Once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was only wind. Fear had become my shadow. That night, I found an abandoned shed, its roof half collapsed, its walls gnawed by time. Inside, I curled into a corner and chewed on snow to calm my hunger. My fingers were purple. My heartbeat sounded like a drum inside my skull. The second day, I woke to silence so deep it frightened me. No birds, no dogs, no gunshots, only the whisper of wind moving through the pines. The world smelled of wood smoke, faint and far away. I followed it, desperate for proof that life still existed. My boots, one torn, one missing, left stains of blood on the snow. I passed a stream frozen mid-motion, its surface cracked like glass. I stared at my reflection and saw a stranger, hollow eyes, cracked lips, ash on my face. The man looking back at me wasn't from the camp anymore. He wasn't from anywhere. By nightfall, I collapsed near a cluster of trees, too weak to move. I thought of Dr. Novak, of Pyotr, of the others. Were they alive? Did anyone else make it through the fence? I would never know. My body shook uncontrollably, my thoughts fading. The snow began to fall again, covering me like a burial cloth. I whispered my parents' names to the sky, not as prayer, but as proof that I once belonged somewhere. The third day, I woke to pain and light. My lips were bleeding, and my hands barely moved. Then I saw it, a faint shape in the distance, a small hut, smoke rising from its chimney. I crawled toward it on my knees, every inch a war. My vision blurred, my body failing. But that thin line of smoke was enough to keep me alive. When I reached the door, I didn't knock. I collapsed against it, half-conscious, my breath fogging the wood. Somewhere inside, a floor creaked. A voice spoke in Polish, cautious, human. The door opened, and the last thing I saw before darkness took me was the outline of a woman holding a lantern. For the first time since Auschwitz, someone looked at me not as a number, but as a man. But I was still afraid. Because freedom, I realized, wasn't safety, it was survival without walls. December 1944, the woman of the forest. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I saw was the glow of a lantern and the outline of a woman bending over me. Her face was lined, her hair hidden beneath a scarf, her eyes both sharp and kind. The smell of smoke and bread filled the small hut. For a moment, I thought I had died, that this was some gentle corner of the afterlife. But then the pain returned, and I knew I was still among the living. Her name was Zofia, a widow from a nearby village. She spoke softly, like someone used to hiding her words. When she asked who I was, I hesitated. I didn't have an answer. My name is... I stopped. The name I'd once had didn't belong to me anymore. Finally, I said, I don't know. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. You've come from the camp, she said. It wasn't a question. She had seen it before, the hollow faces, the striped rags, the trembling hands. Zofia cleaned my wounds with boiled water and wrapped me in a wool blanket that smelled of hay and smoke. She gave me a piece of bread, the first real food I'd tasted in months. I ate slowly, afraid it was a dream. When I tried to thank her, she shook her head. Don't waste words, she whispered. Out here, silence saves lives. For 2 days, I stayed hidden in her barn, beneath the haystack beside a broken plow. I could hear soldiers passing by on the road outside, German voices, trucks rumbling, the sound of dogs. Each time they passed, Zofia placed her hand over my mouth until the noise faded. She risked everything for me, a stranger. When I asked her why, she looked out the window and said, because someone once hid my son. He didn't survive, but I still owe the debt. At night, she told me that the front was moving closer, the Red Army was advancing from the east, the Germans retreating in chaos. But the forests were full of patrols, deserters, and death. Freedom, she said, was a dangerous road. You're not free, she warned me, You're only alive. Don't confuse the two. Those words cut deeper than any whip or bullet. I wanted to believe that survival meant victory, but in her eyes I saw a truth I wasn't ready to face. The war might end, but the memories would not. Before dawn on the third day, Zofia gave me a coat and a small loaf of bread. Go west, she said. Follow the river. Stay low. As I stepped into the snow, she stopped me. If you live long enough, she added, remember us, the ones who stayed. I looked back once before the forest swallowed her house. The smoke from her chimney curled into the sky like a fragile promise. I didn't know then that this woman, this quiet soul in the woods, would become the anchor of my humanity, the last warm memory in a world still frozen by war. January 1945. The Burned Portrait. I stayed hidden in Zofia's barn for a week while the war moved around us like a distant storm. Each morning, she brought me scraps of bread and boiled potatoes, and each night, the sound of artillery echoed from the east. The snow outside was gray with soot. From the small hole in the barn wall, I could see the faint glow of burning villages on the horizon. The war wasn't ending, it was devouring itself. One evening, while trying to find a warmer corner, I discovered something behind the hay, a frame, half burned, its wood blackened by fire. Inside it was a portrait, what remained of a child's face, one blue eye still visible beneath the smoke. Stains. I brought it to Zofia. She froze when she saw it, her hands trembling. That was my son, she said softly. His name was Merrick. She told me the story in fragments, her voice steady but hollow. The Gestapo had come months earlier, searching for partisans. Her husband was shot trying to stop them. Her son, barely 8 years old, was taken as punishment. They said they were taking him to a camp for re-education, she whispered. I knew what that meant. She burned everything they had touched, clothes, toys, even the photographs, but one portrait survived, hidden behind the wall. The fire had reached it anyway. I held the frame carefully, as if it were sacred. The child's gaze, though half destroyed, seemed to look through me, accusing and forgiving at once. Zofia turned away, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. You think the hardest part was inside the camp, she said. But out here, the war keeps killing in smaller ways. That night, I couldn't sleep. The barn creaked with the weight of snow, and through the cracks I could see the faint flicker of distant flames. I thought of Merrick, of my own family, my parents, my younger sister, all lost somewhere in the machinery of death. For the first time since my escape, I allowed myself to cry. The tears froze before they reached the straw. In the morning, I helped Zofia patch the barn roof. She worked in silence, her movements strong and deliberate. At one point, she said, "You can't bury memories. They grow roots." I nodded, though I didn't yet understand. When I left her that afternoon, I placed the burned portrait back where I had found it, behind the hay. So he can keep watching, I told her. She smiled faintly. He always does. As I stepped outside, the wind carried the sound of explosions, faint, distant, but constant. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the front lines were shifting, the war bleeding toward its end. Yet inside me, I felt something heavier than fear, the knowledge that survival wasn't freedom. It was responsibility. The dead had left their stories in our hands, and mine were already trembling. January 1945, the train of refugees. Zofia woke me before dawn. The air was sharp with cold, and the forest beyond her hut was veiled in mist. They're retreating, she said. You can hear it. And I could, the sound of engines, boots, and chaos. The Germans were pulling back toward the west. She pressed a bundle into my hands, a small piece of bread, 2 boiled potatoes, and a folded scrap of paper that turned out to be a forged travel pass. If they stop you, she said, say you're a displaced worker from Krakow. Keep your head down. Don't look anyone in the eyes. I hugged her, though neither of us spoke. Then I left. The forest stretched for miles before giving way to tracks and open fields, where black smoke rose from a derailed train. The stench of burning coal and frozen flesh mixed in the air. I followed the railway north, moving with the wind, until I reached a station half destroyed by bombings. There, amid the rubble, stood another train, this one loaded with refugees. Its wagons were open, crowded with civilians, women wrapped in blankets, old men clutching sacks, children staring with hollow eyes. I climbed aboard without being questioned. The train shuddered to life, groaning as it began to move toward Krakow. No one spoke. Only the rumble of wheels and the occasional sob filled the silence. Across from me sat a wounded German soldier, his uniform torn, his face pale with frost. He held a photograph of a woman and child, staring at it as if it might pull him out of the war. He caught me looking and said, in broken Polish, "Everyone's running from something." I turned away, not out of hatred, but because he was right. The countryside we passed was a wasteland, fields frozen under ash, trees shattered by artillery, villages burned to the ground. Here and there, I saw figures dragging carts, carrying what little remained of their lives. Every few kilometers, the train slowed to let in more people. They climbed aboard like ghosts, bringing with them rumors. The Soviets were near, the Reich was collapsing, the war was ending. Yet no one looked relieved. The end of one terror only meant the beginning of another. At one stop, a woman offered me a piece of apple, shriveled and brown but sweet. I hadn't tasted fruit since before Auschwitz. When I thanked her, she whispered, "Eat. The dead don't need food." Her words stayed with me. That night, I dreamt of the camp again, the smoke, the fences, Dr. Novak's voice. I woke with my heart racing, unsure whether I was still free or just lost in a larger prison. The train rattled on, carrying us deeper into a dying country. By morning, the sound of distant artillery reached our ears, thunder rolling from the east. A man shouted, "The Russians are close." Some cheered, some prayed, others simply stared ahead. I looked out the open side of the wagon and saw the sun rising through the smoke, a red, angry sun, the color of blood and hope. For the first time, I dared to believe that Auschwitz might truly be behind me. But as I looked at the faces around me, hollow, broken, and silent, I understood, we were all still prisoners, just in a world too large to escape. February 1945, the Ghost City. The train crept into Krakow at dusk, its wheels screeching like a wounded animal. The city that once pulsed with laughter and church bells was now a skeleton of stone. The station was half destroyed, its roof collapsed, its platforms littered with ash and the smell of iron. People scattered as soon as the train stopped, each moving in silence, as if afraid to awaken the ruins. I stepped down onto the frozen ground. My shoes were torn, my breath a cloud of white. The streets I once knew were unrecognizable, entire blocks reduced to rubble, tram lines twisted like vines. The river ran black with soot. On a corner where I remembered a cafe, there was now only a burned-out shell, the word Kawa faintly visible on the wall. I had returned home, yet nothing about it felt like home. I walked for hours through the city's carcass, searching for something familiar. Once, I saw a group of German soldiers retreating toward the west, their faces gray and hollow. They didn't even glance at me. They were no longer conquerors, just men fleeing their own defeat. The few civilians who remained kept their doors locked, their eyes low. War had taught everyone the same lesson: trust no one, speak less, survive quietly. I reached my old street by midnight. My family's apartment had been bombed. Only a single wall stood, with pieces of wallpaper still clinging to it. In the ruins, I found the handle of a teapot my mother used to love. I held it until my hands bled. For the first time since escaping Auschwitz, I screamed. The sound tore through the night, swallowed by the empty city. No one came. When dawn broke, I wandered to Wawel Hill, where the castle loomed like a ghost of another world. The air smelled of gunpowder and snow. I sat on the steps of the cathedral and watched Soviet soldiers march through the streets below, their tanks rumbling across cobblestones. They raised red flags over what was left of Krakow. People emerged cautiously from the ruins, some weeping, others staring in disbelief. Liberation had come, but it felt nothing like freedom. A Russian officer offered me a piece of bread. I took it, nodding in silence. He looked at me curiously, then said in broken Polish, "You look alive." That's rare these days. I didn't know how to answer. Alive wasn't the right word. I was breathing, yes, but the man I'd been had died long ago behind the wire. As night fell again, I found shelter in a church basement. Candles flickered on the altar, their light trembling like the hands of the few who prayed. I lay on the cold stone floor, surrounded by echoes of my own thoughts. Outside, Krakow's bells rang faintly for the first time in months, a sound both holy and hollow. Freedom had returned to the city, but not to its people. The streets were alive only with ghosts, and I walked among them, one more lost soul searching for meaning in the ruins. March 1945, the newspaper no one wanted to read. The weeks after liberation were filled with chaos and disbelief. The Soviets controlled Krakow now, but the city was still dying, not from bombs, but from silence. The living wandered through ruins like beggars of memory. No one asked questions. No one wanted answers. I found shelter in a convent that had been turned into a hospital for refugees. The nuns spoke in whispers, their habits darkened by soot. They gave me food, a bed, and paper, precious paper. I began to write. Not to heal, but to remember. Every night, I filled the pages with what I had seen, the smoke, the dogs, the names turned into numbers. I wrote until my hands cramped and the ink froze on the nib. When the stack grew thick, I knew what I had to do. I walked to a nearby building where a Soviet newspaper office had been set up, the only one still printing anything in the city. I waited for hours, surrounded by soldiers and displaced souls trying to find news of their families. When it was my turn, I approached the editor, a man with deep-set eyes and the smell of tobacco. I was in Auschwitz, I told him. I escaped. I wrote what happened. He looked up briefly, then down again at his papers. Everyone has a story now, he said in Russian-accented Polish. This one isn't a story, I said. It's truth. He sighed, took my pages, and read a few lines. Then he stopped. This, he said quietly, is impossible. No one will believe it. I stood there, numb. I was there, I said. I saw it. He slid the papers back across the desk. Then let history decide, he muttered. I walked out into the snow, holding my manuscript like a corpse. The streets were crowded with people who had survived too much to care. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them see. But I realized something dreadful. Freedom had blinded them as much as captivity had blinded us. That night, I burned 2 pages in a metal bowl for warmth. The fire danced across the words until they vanished. I couldn't save the dead that way. I could only remember. The next morning, I began again. April 1945, the return of Zofia. I was walking along a ruined road outside Krakow when I heard someone calling for help. The sound was faint, carried by the wind. I followed it to a group of children huddled beside a cart stuck in the mud. And there, helping them push, was Zofia. For a moment, I couldn't speak. She looked thinner, older, her coat patched and torn, but her eyes still held the same quiet strength. When she saw me, she froze, then smiled as if she'd been expecting me all along. So you lived, she said softly. Good. Now help me keep them alive. The cart carried orphans, 7 of them, maybe 8, their faces hidden under scarves. Zofia had been moving from village to village, rescuing children left behind by retreating soldiers and bombed-out homes. She kept a small notebook listing their names, birthplaces, and any memory they could still recall. If the world survives, she told me, someone will need to remember who they were. I joined her without question. Together, we walked through ruined villages and burned fields, scavenging food, avoiding soldiers. The war was ending, but death hadn't stopped, it just changed its uniform. We buried the bodies we found by the roadside, said small prayers no one would hear, and moved on. At night, we slept in barns or under bridges. Zofia hummed lullabies to the children, songs from before the war. Her voice cracked, but they listened anyway. Sometimes, in the quiet between verses, she would whisper, "They killed my son, but I won't let them kill every child." One evening, we crossed a river where bodies floated like broken dolls. I turned away, but Zofia didn't. She stood there, eyes fixed on the water, and said, "We don't look away anymore. That's how it begins again." In her, I found what I had lost: purpose. We weren't fugitives anymore. We were witnesses. Each child we saved was a defiance, a small rebellion against the silence that had buried the truth. When spring finally came, the snow melted and flowers began to grow in the ditches, fragile, stubborn, alive. Zofia looked at them and smiled. "See," she said, "the world still remembers how to begin again." And for the first time since escaping Auschwitz, I believed her. January 1945, the arrival of the Soviets. The thunder began before dawn, a deep, rolling sound that shook the frozen ground. Zofia and I had spent the night in an abandoned schoolhouse with the children. When we stepped outside, the sky was glowing red in the east. The front was moving toward us. The Germans were gone, their banners burned or buried in the snow. What remained was emptiness, and the distant roar of liberation. By midday, the first Soviet tanks rolled down the road. Their treads crushed the ice with the sound of bones breaking. Soldiers followed on foot, wrapped in heavy coats, rifles slung across their shoulders. They looked at us not as enemies, but as ghosts returned from another world. One of them, a young man with dirt on his face, offered Zofia a cigarette and said, "You can come out now. It's over." But it didn't feel over. The air still carried the scent of death. We followed them to Oswiecim, the town beside the camp. The closer we got, the quieter the soldiers became. When we reached the gates, they stopped speaking altogether. The snow was black here, the ground scorched. The barbed wire still hummed faintly in the wind. And beyond it, the barracks, the chimneys, the endless silence of the dead. When the Soviets entered Auschwitz, no one cheered. There were no flags, no songs. Only the creak of wooden doors opening and the sight of human beings who no longer looked human. Survivors stood in lines, motionless, wrapped in rags. Their eyes were the color of dust. Some whispered, "Thank you," others just stared. A soldier beside me took off his hat and began to weep. I couldn't move. I was back where I had escaped, standing among ghosts that had never left. The wind carried ashes that glittered like snow. I recognized a wall, a path, a shadow of memory. I wanted to fall to my knees, but Zofia's hand gripped mine. "Don't," she whispered. "You made it out. Let them rest." When night fell, the soldiers built fires and handed out bread. The survivors ate like frightened animals, too weak to believe in kindness. I sat apart, watching the flames reflect in the puddles of melted snow. Freedom had arrived, but it had come too late for most. I cried for the first time without shame. Not for myself, but for those whose names would never be spoken again. The Soviets lit the camp with their lanterns, but even their fire couldn't chase away the darkness that lived here. The next morning, I left a piece of bread on the ground by the fence and whispered a prayer. It was the only funeral I could give them. February 1945, the diary in the shoe. In the weeks after the liberation, the Soviets began gathering evidence, photographs, testimonies, lists of names. They asked questions I didn't know how to answer. How many died? How were they killed? How did you escape? I told them what I could, but words failed against the scale of what I had seen. I carried with me a small bundle, scraps of paper I had written during my hiding, pages torn from Zofia's old notebook. On them were fragments, names, dates, sketches of faces already fading from memory. I hid them in my shoe, under the lining, afraid they'd be lost or destroyed. One day, I approached a Soviet officer who seemed different, younger, quieter. I handed him the notebook and said, "Please, this must survive." He read a few lines, then looked up. "You write like a poet," he said. "But the world needs proof, not poetry." I didn't answer. Proof was for courts. Words were for the living. Weeks later, as I helped clear debris from one of the barracks, I found a child's drawing on the wall, stick figures under a crooked sun, drawn in charcoal. Someone had written beneath it, "Mama waits." I added a line beside it, "She still does." Then I walked away. Years later, I would learn that parts of my notes, my poetry, had been copied into an official Soviet report on Auschwitz. They called it anonymous testimony. My name was gone, but my words remained. Perhaps that was enough. I often think of that officer's face, his tired eyes when he said those words. He was wrong, or maybe I was. Because proof fades. Evidence can be buried. But memory, even when written by trembling hands, survives. That night, I burned the last page of the notebook in Zofia's stove. The fire flickered and died, leaving only smoke curling toward the ceiling. I whispered to it, "Go tell them." And for the first time since the war began, I slept without nightmares. March 1945, the letter I never sent. When the spring thaw began, the roads turned to rivers of mud, and with them came the news, lists of the dead, of the missing, of the found. I searched every record the Soviets posted on church doors and radio bulletins, scanning for the names of my parents and my sister, Anya. Each time, the answer was the same: silence. One afternoon, in what remained of a post office, I found a pile of unused stationery. The paper was thin, yellowed, but clean. I sat by the window, sunlight catching the dust in the air, and I began to write. Not to anyone living, but to the ones who would never read it. Mama, Papa, Anya. I ran. I crawled through mud and smoke and came out breathing. I thought that meant I had escaped. But now I understand. I didn't escape Auschwitz. I brought it with me. It lives in my bones, in my sleep, in the silence between words. I wrote about Zofia, about the children she saved, about the portrait of her son. I wrote about Novak, about the boy named Leon, about Pyotr who loosened the bricks. I wrote until my hands cramped and the ink bled through the paper. At the end, I wrote, "You died, but you live inside the witness. I live, but I died inside the smoke." When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and sealed it without an address. I carried it with me for years, through borders, through countries, through lives. I never mailed it. Some memories are too heavy for postage. One evening, when the war was officially declared over, I took the letter to the edge of a river near Krakow. I watched the current drag branches and ice toward the horizon. I thought of throwing it in, letting the water take it. But I couldn't. I slipped it back into my coat pocket. Freedom had returned, but I wasn't ready to let go of the dead. November 1946. The trial. A year later, I was summoned to Nuremberg as a witness. I arrived with trembling hands and a suitcase full of papers. The courtroom was vast, cold, too clean, a place where evil was measured in documents and signatures. Rows of translators sat behind glass, their voices echoing through headphones. On the benches sat men in uniforms, men who once gave orders that turned millions into ash. They looked ordinary. That was the worst part. Ordinary faces behind extraordinary crimes. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the stand and swore the oath. The prosecutor asked me to describe what I saw. I spoke slowly, clearly, forcing each word into existence. I told them about the chimneys, the dogs, the snow that smelled of burning flesh. I told them about the man who prayed until his voice broke, about the children who vanished, about the doctor who said the sky was made of smoke. The courtroom was silent. Not the respectful kind, the fearful kind. The kind that comes when words are too heavy to move through. When I finished, the prosecutor asked, "Do you hate the Germans?" I looked at the men in the dock, pale, sweating, their eyes avoiding mine. I thought of the German soldier on the train, holding his family's photograph. I thought of the editor who said my story was impossible. Then I said quietly, "No. I don't hate them. I hate the silence that allowed them to exist." When I left the stand, I saw journalists scribbling notes. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, as if I were a rare specimen. But I wasn't their story. I was the echo of all the stories they ignored. That night, in my hotel room, I looked out the window at the city lights. Justice had begun, but it didn't bring peace. Nothing could. The dead were still gone, and the living were still haunted. May 1948. Zofia's Garden. Years passed. Europe rebuilt itself, as if concrete could erase memory. I drifted from country to country, a refugee with no destination, until one spring I found myself back in Poland. The air was warmer, the fields green again. I followed the old road through the forest until I reached a small farm I recognized instantly. Zofia was there. Older, slower, but alive. She was kneeling in her yard, planting tulip bulbs in neat rows above the remains of an old bunker. When she saw me, she smiled and said, "You kept your promise. You remembered." Her house smelled of bread again. The children she had once saved were grown now, scattered across the country, some with families of their own. On her wall hung a new portrait of her son, painted by one of those children. The colors were bright, defiant, alive. We walked through her garden as the sun set. "The earth doesn't forget," she said. "But it forgives in its own way. Look, Even the soil that buried ashes can grow flowers. I knelt beside her and touched the tulips. Their petals were soft, red as the dawn I'd seen the day the Soviets came. I felt something loosen inside me, a quiet acceptance, maybe even peace. Zofia poured us tea and said, "You survived for a reason. To tell them. That's all any of us can do." That night, I slept in her house, the first real sleep in years. The wind outside carried the scent of earth and new rain. I dreamed not of fire or fences, but of sunlight and the sound of children laughing somewhere beyond the trees. When I woke, she was already in the garden, humming softly, her hands in the soil. The tulips were opening. And for the first time, I understood, life doesn't forget death, it grows through it. June 1963, freedom after freedom. I live now in Jerusalem, in a small house on a quiet street filled with olive trees. The air smells of dust and sunlight, not smoke. Children play outside, shouting in a language I once thought was lost forever. Sometimes I sit by the window and listen. Their laughter sounds like forgiveness. On my arm, the number 42,178 is still there, faded but unforgotten. My grandchildren once asked what it meant. I told them it was the proof that I lived, and that the living must remember. They didn't understand, not yet, but one day they will. In the mornings, I write. Not about horror anymore, but about survival, the small moments that made it possible. A piece of bread shared, a song hummed in the dark, a woman planting tulips over ruins. Those things kept the world alive when God looked away. Sometimes, at dawn, the wind carries a scent of burning wood, and for a heartbeat, I am back there, behind the wire beneath the smoke. But then I hear the call to prayer from the hills, the sound of life continuing, and I breathe again. I once thought freedom was the absence of walls. Now I know it's the courage to live with what they left inside you. Dr. Novak was right. Whoever escapes must speak. And Zofia was right too. The earth forgives, even when men do not. So I tell their stories again and again, because to remember is to free the dead one more time. And in that, at last, I find my peace.